A normal morning, but no one knew that. Just minutes later, this place would erupt into a media frenzy. One of the greatest justice explosions in the aviation industry was quietly beginning. Grace and Daniel walked up to the business class check-in counter. The 5 white passengers ahead of them? They simply handed over their tickets and breezed through, no questions asked. Grace smiled, handing over her ticket, already calculating her schedule for after landing. But instead of the usual friendly smile, the check-in staff narrowed his eyes. His gaze swept over her, from her neatly combed curly hair, to her warm brown skin, to her perfectly tailored business dress. It was as if he was looking for a reason to reject her. "Are you sure this business class ticket is yours?" His voice was cold. Daniel, walking right behind her, paused, his eyes immediately wary. Something was off. Grace kept her calm. She nodded slightly. "Yes, this is my ticket." The staff frowned, as if her response wasn't enough. "Who bought this ticket for you? Did you pay for it yourself, or?" Grace calmly pulled out her phone, showing proof of personal payment. He didn't even glance at it. Without a word, he gestured for the supervisor. The supervisor stepped forward, eyes sharp, as if Grace were a test subject to be dismissed. "We need further verification. Your membership card or proof of income?" Grace pulled out her diamond card. Placing it on the counter, the silver gleamed under the harsh lights, but the supervisor just sneered. "Anyone can borrow a card like that." Daniel stepped forward, not shouting, not arguing. He simply moved in front of Grace, his voice low and controlled. "The card is hers, the ticket is valid, we're traveling together." The supervisor shook her head. "Please cooperate." 2 security officers appeared, their faces cold as stone. One pointed wordlessly, no explanation given. Grace and Daniel were separated from the crowd and led down a narrow, cold corridor. The air thick with the smell of bleach and metal. The sound of shoes scraping echoed in the oppressive silence. A man in a polo shirt smirked. "Guess they're at the wrong gate. Economy's over there." A few chuckles rose, a few awkward glances. No one stood up. Grace clenched her fist. Daniel gripped the strap of his bag, his gaze razor sharp. Among the sea of people turning away, 2 lone figures moved deeper into the private screening area, as if they were suspects. But in that very moment, Daniel quietly pulled out his Virtu phone. A luxury device, subtle, not flashy. The overhead light reflected off its glossy surface. He pressed the familiar shortcut. Protocol Michelle, activate. And just like that, a system that had been dormant for years suddenly woke up. An unfamiliar passenger accidentally recorded the entire scene. A hashtag began to spread, "This is first class." And what it revealed, a deep-rooted racial discrimination network in the American aviation industry. No one was prepared for what was about to unfold. But the truth didn't need permission to exist. This story wasn't just theirs. It could be yours, your family's, anyone who's ever been judged because of their skin color, the way they speak, the way they dress, or the type of ticket they hold. If you've ever felt the need to prove your worth, if you've ever thought that justice was only for the lucky ones, let this story speak for you, and for the millions still silenced. If this story touched you, hit like. Share your story in the comments. What moment left the strongest impression on you? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on courageous stories, stories of truth and humanity, taking you higher, like Ubuntu Air. But before Grace was questioned over the ticket in her hand, she had to prove her worth, from a place much harsher. Grace Okoye walked up to the check-in counter, holding her first-class boarding pass. She dressed simply, yet it was impossible not to notice her. A beige cashmere coat, a dark brown Louis Vuitton Neverfull bag, a delicate pearl necklace gleamed softly under the airport lights. Nothing flashy, nothing excessive. She didn't need to show off. She knew her worth. Not from a logo, but from the way she lived. Once a little girl in Kiambu, walking 5 miles a day under the scorching sun on dusty, dirty red roads. But those hardships had taught her a lesson. Elegance isn't about material wealth, it's about maintaining your dignity, no matter what. Today, Grace wasn't walking into the first-class lounge to prove anything. She was walking in because she had come a long way, strong enough to know that she belonged here. But the woman at the front desk couldn't see that. She looked Grace up and down. A slight frown. Not out of surprise, just doubt. "Are you sure you can afford to be here?" she asked. her voice polite but full of questioning. Grace didn't answer. She just smiled lightly, pulled out the first-class ticket, along with her shiny platinum membership card. But the attendant's attitude didn't change. The doubt remained. As if the documents in front of her simply didn't exist. "We'll need to verify with management," she said, her tone flat like she was reading from a script. Those words weren't wrong, but in that moment, they cut deep. A small, invisible wound that silently bled Grace's dignity. Grace didn't flinch. She stood there, her eyes unwavering, but inside something curled up. She was protecting herself. Her husband, Daniel, stepped up. He said nothing, just looked at the staff with calm, unwavering eyes. "Is there a problem with my wife's first-class ticket?" His voice was deep, with no room for wasting time. The attendant avoided his gaze. Her response was mechanical. "We just need to verify some additional information, sir." Her voice sounded like she was talking about a package, not a person, not a woman who had walked thousands of miles to stand right here today. But Daniel knew. Some things can't be explained by paperwork. Daniel frowned. In that moment, he understood. This wasn't a procedural issue. It was a matter of perception, a form of silent discrimination disguised as procedure. If no one questions it, it will keep happening. It will keep trampling the dignity of those who aren't fit. Daniel smiled lightly, not to ease the tension, but to maintain his composure. Before speaking, he made it clear. "We're platinum members of the airline. We have first-class tickets and all the proper documents." He turned to his wife, a woman who had lived with grace and kindness, who didn't deserve to be disrespected for the way she looked or for what she was wearing. The attendant paused, then replied stiffly, "I'm just following what the system tells me." Her voice was cold, as if an automatic machine was answering. She wasn't malicious. She was just used to treating people like data. Daniel stared at her. Not out of anger, but because he was starting to ask the questions the system was afraid of. "Where is this policy written?" His voice calm but firm. "Is there any document that says a first-class passenger with valid paperwork, a platinum card, and an online check-in should be subjected to extra screening?" Silence. The attendant avoided his gaze. This wasn't about procedure. This was about perception. This was about appearance. Or is this personal judgment hidden behind the word procedure? She shifted slightly, her voice dropping. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a directive from the system. I can't share more." Her eyes blinked quickly. Daniel understood. The issue wasn't the young woman standing before him. It was the invisible framework behind her. The system. Designed to eliminate discrimination. But it created it in the most subtle way. A system without a heart, only knowing how to follow orders. But the worst part had yet to come. In reality, when no one takes responsibility, it reinforces discrimination more effectively than ever before. Not because it's malicious, but because it lacks a heart. Daniel slowly nodded. The polite smile from before had disappeared. In his mind, all the pieces were falling into place, like a bug in the code finally leading to the root error. This wasn't just an indifferent employee. It wasn't just a timid middle manager. This was the face of deep, clever bias, wrapped in the tailored coat called procedure. He lowered his voice, but his gaze remained unwavering. "I want to know, according to the official policy, what criteria does the system use to determine which passengers require additional screening?" The response came as if it were programmed. "Passengers are randomly selected, sir." Daniel stared at her. Silence, a slight shake of his head. Not because it was shocking, but because it was too familiar, detached, a cycle, and completely uncontrollable. Then he realized he needed to talk to someone who truly understood what this system was built to protect. Daniel asked to speak with the supervisor. A few minutes later, a middle manager appeared, a sharp suit, a polished appearance, and a voice so familiar it felt like reading from a teleprompter. "We have the right to conduct additional screening if we detect any irregularities." Daniel looked him straight in the eyes. His voice dropped, gentle but as firm as steel beneath velvet. "What exactly is considered an irregularity?" A moment of silence hung in the air. The supervisor's brow furrowed. Then he lowered his voice, as if afraid the walls around him might be listening. "I'm sorry, sir, but that's a directive from the system. I'm not authorized to disclose further details." a statement that sounded professional. But in reality, it hid something far more dangerous than discrimination, an excuse. Created by a system no one can see, no one can trace, and no one is held accountable for. At that moment, a few nearby passengers started to notice. An elderly man, gray hair, sweater, holding a paper coffee cup, walked over and said loudly, "I just walked into the lounge 2 minutes ago. No one asked me anything." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Daniel calmly pulled out his phone. He dialed the airline's customer service number. The call bounced from one line to the next, until it ended with hold music, then silence. He tucked the phone back in his pocket, sighed, and his gaze turned cold, like the fogged-up glass before a storm. "Thanks for confirming." He pulled out his Virtu phone from his blazer pocket, not to make a regular call, but the thing that had been dormant had just been awakened. He pressed a familiar shortcut and spoke softly. "Aura. Activate full-spectrum surveillance mode." Just 5 words, but those were the first tremors of a far greater force hidden deep beneath. No one in the room knew that a silent power had begun to record every action, every glance, every whispered word full of bias. Still, Daniel returned with his voice steady, calm, in control. "I'm sorry, but could you please point to the exact policy that calls for additional screening for a first-class passenger with valid ID, a confirmed ticket, and an online check-in?" The staff member looked away and repeated, word for word, her earlier statement. "This is a random check, sir." Daniel didn't reply. He took out his wallet, placed his Platinum Priority member card on the counter, along with a printed email confirming the first-class ticket sent directly from Altaris Airlines. But all he received was doubt, the way they looked at his wife, as if she were a system error, a mistake that didn't belong here. They told him the system couldn't verify the information, even though the data was as clear as crystal. At that moment, a security officer walked in. He didn't ask anything. He didn't clarify anything. He simply walked over, quickly glanced at the couple, then spoke in a mechanical, strong voice. "Sir, ma'am, I need you both to step aside. You're blocking the line." As if they were the problem, not the ones being victimized. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. A few nearby passengers quietly pulled out their phones. Someone started recording, and then whispers started. "Why are they only checking her? I went through earlier and no one asked me anything. This isn't right." The air grew heavier, not because of the noise, but because of something else, a silent suffocation, as if injustice suddenly became clear, weighing down on everyone in the room. It wasn't anything new, but this time it wasn't going to escape the lens. Daniel took a step back, not out of fear, but to clear his thoughts, to separate himself from the emotional noise and activate a process he'd prepared for years. From his coat, he pulled out the Virtu. No rush, no words. Just a touch, and the screen lit up. He scrolled, searching for a name, Leah Okoro. His voice was deep, steady, like a man who knew this moment would come. "Leah, activate full-spectrum surveillance, first-class lounge, gate 27, Atlanta International Airport. Record all discriminatory actions, every procedural violation, or any suspicious directive from above." An unseen eye had just opened. On the other end of the line, Leah showed no surprise. Her response was smooth, sharp, and full of training. "Confirmed. The system is now in full observation mode. I'll monitor all activities and report any irregularities." In that very moment, Aura came to life. No flashing lights, no sound, no notifications, just Grace's gaze, gliding across a subtle beam of light. Something was changing. A silent system, now fully awake. And this time, there would be no tape to erase. The moment Grace was denied access to the lounge, a passenger nearby uploaded a video, TikTok X, a video barely 30 seconds long. With just one caption, she showed her ticket. "Why isn't it enough?" Within minutes, the video spread like wildfire. Comments started flooding in, fast, angry, unrestrained. "Classic racism. Just like my dad's story in 2019. She looks more elegant than most of us. Send this to CNN now." Daniel ended the call. He slid the Virtu back into his coat. Then he turned, no raising his voice, no arguing, no explaining. He simply walked back to the counter and looked the attendant straight in the eyes, not with anger, but with a cold, unsettling calm, like the silence before a storm. And in that gaze, there was something she couldn't name, the feeling that she was no longer the observer, but a part of the record. A wave was rising, quiet, steady, unstoppable. She shuddered, just slightly. Not because Daniel had threatened her with words, but because, for the first time, she realized she no longer controlled the story. His name was Dr. Daniel Okoye, a Kenyan-American businessman, the founder of Aura, Artificial Intelligence for Global Rights and Accountability, a platform built not just on code but on conscience, where data isn't just numbers, testimony. Aura wasn't built to compete with OpenAI. It wasn't just a product, it was a force of resistance, not defined by power but by its purpose. Aura wasn't built to learn clever answers. It was built to learn how to stand on the side of what's right. It's not optimized for user convenience. It fights for the dignity of the forgotten. And today, at the heart of Atlanta International Airport, it began recording a story that would challenge the very foundations of the American airline industry. But to understand why today mattered so much, we need to go back in time. Daniel was born in New Jersey, but his family's American dream didn't start there. It began in a tin-roofed shack in Kiambu, Kenya, where every rainstorm threatened to wash away hope, where his mother, Miriam Okoye, sold everything she had left just to give it to a stranger, the one who promised to take her to the promised land. A train ride, no lights, no name, no guarantee she'd survive the journey, but she agreed because she had nothing left to lose, except for one thing: her belief that her son would grow up in a world fairer than the one she had known. When she arrived in the U.S., she took all the jobs no one else wanted: washing dishes, scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets in grocery stores. She didn't complain. She just bowed her head and worked. Eventually, she found a steady job as a janitor at JFK Airport. She wore her uniform like it was battle armor. She treated her name tag as if it carried the weight of her family's name. She showed up early and stayed late. Her colleagues respected her. Her supervisors praised her. Until one night, a lost suitcase. An angry white passenger, no evidence, no investigation, just a nod from management, fired. No defense, no hearing, just one email and a printed pre-signed termination notice. That night, Daniel, only 8 years old, saw his mother come home in silence. She sat quietly on the porch step, pulled something from her pocket, and took off her name tag. No tears. She just sat there, staring into the darkness in front of her, as if the dignity she had defended her whole life had been erased by a thoughtless decision. It was the first time Daniel understood: injustice doesn't need a reason. And from that moment on, Daniel no longer walked for himself. And from that day, he studied as if racing against the world. Daniel rose to the top in every class. He earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university. But in the final interview, one board member glanced through his application, then said coldly, "We need to balance the racial quotas. This position has been awarded to a white candidate. They have stronger soft skills." Even though Daniel had a higher GPA, a more impressive resume, and reference letters twice as long, Daniel didn't argue. He just lowered his gaze and walked out of the room. And in that moment, he promised himself, if the system couldn't measure people fairly, he would build a system that could. His first startup was an AI platform for nonprofits, designed to help them predict market trends and operate more efficiently. He put everything into it: his energy, his heart, and the hope that someday it would help his mother escape a life of struggle after so many years. But he was still too young, too idealistic, too trusting. In just 1 year, a group of investors he trusted forced him to sign an intellectual property sale contract, a contract full of fine print and legal traps. They took the technology, sold it to a major corporation, erased his name from every document. Daniel could have sued, he could have fought back, but he didn't. He disappeared. For the next 3 years, he was completely gone from the tech world. No conferences, no press, no LinkedIn updates. Just one quiet phrase beginning to circulate in the startup community: Daniel Okoye will be back, but this time, no one will take anything from him. 3 years later, he truly returned, silently, purposefully. And this time, it was on his own terms. He didn't fundraise. He only had one idea and a vision: to build an AI platform that couldn't be manipulated. Not just smart, but fair. Not just excellent, but guided by conscience. From that vision, Aura was born. Not to make money, but to protect people like his mother, the ones whose dignity was stripped away simply because no one stood up for them. But even the strongest systems can't fix a heart that refuses to change. Present day. Aura, the ethical AI system Daniel built from the ground up, is now legally integrated into major companies across the US, from healthcare, education, to logistics, and even in one of the largest resistant industries, aviation. One of the first airlines to adopt it was Altaris Airlines. Their goal? To enhance the customer experience, eliminate bias in everyday operations, and ensure that, from ground staff to flight crew, every decision is based on objective data, not hidden prejudice. That's why Daniel chose Altaris as a strategic partner. Because if there's one place where fairness matters the most, it's the starting point of every journey, the airport. But it was right there that Daniel realized a painful truth. Even ethical technology can't fix a system when the people in it refuse to change. That day he sat alone in the main hall of Atlanta Airport. His eyes stared ahead, empty. One hand holding a now cold Starbucks cup. And his heart numb as he watched Grace being pulled aside for further screening. His wife. The woman who had lived her life with Grace. The one who had never harmed a soul. Still smiling politely when misunderstood, now questioned, scrutinized, not because she did anything wrong, but because she didn't wear a giant Chanel logo on her chest, because she chose to walk with quiet dignity. And around her, everyone stood still. No one said a word, no one asked why, just a few curious glances, a few indifferent shrugs, and that familiar silence, the kind that fills a room where injustice has become a daily occurrence. Daniel felt it rising in his chest. Not anger, but sorrow. But Daniel knew all too well what was happening right before his eyes was exactly what he had spent his entire life trying to break. And today, it wasn't from an anomaly in the data. It wasn't in the spreadsheets. It wasn't flagged by Aura in its ethical analysis models. It came from a look, a softly biased voice, and the indifferent nod of a manager, a nod signaling, "I don't want to take responsibility." Daniel, the one who had written thousands of lines of code to monitor fairness, was now forced to face something unprogrammable. The pain of humanity. He started paying closer attention. A black man being pulled aside at security just for wearing a hoodie. An Asian girl being questioned for 5 extra minutes because her passport looked different. A boy being held back for his old laptop, flagged as unverified foreign hardware. Each individual situation, nothing that would make headlines. But when they appeared side by side, repeatedly, always targeting those who didn't fit the mold, it was no longer random. It became a pattern. But as Daniel looked closer, he discovered something more dangerous than personal bias. It was no longer random. This was a classification system, where some people were always waved through, while others, no matter how well prepared, qualified, or dignified, were always stopped. Daniel looked around. The airport was no longer a gateway of opportunity. It was a machine of categorization. Aura, he realized, was not just a tool for support. It had to be a system of surveillance and resistance. He stood up, walking silently, not with source code, but with truth, with evidence, and once again, with the very hands that had built Aura from the ashes of shattered trust. But what Daniel saw next tore another hole in the trust he had left. Aisha Khalid stepped up to the security checkpoint. The cold airport lights illuminated her green headscarf, highlighting her quiet presence amidst the surrounding hustle. 32 years old, a teacher, she had nothing to prove. But today, it was different. She carried STEM textbooks for the children that the system sometimes forgets, the children who deserve education and respect, just like her. But today, that gaze was not one of respect. The TSA agent looked at her, not just a glance. She could feel the suspicion sharp in the air, their eyes cold, as if she were a potential threat. Unclear records, they said, their voices cold as ice, scrutinizing every detail. No apology. No empathy. Aisha felt every word as cuts to her heart. She didn't respond immediately. She simply shrugged and calmly replied, "I'm an American citizen. This is my ticket." But they didn't stop. Their hands rummaged through her purse, inspecting everything like they were searching a suspicious item. The eyes of the passengers around her glanced over, then turned away. No one spoke up, just Aisha, standing there, her heart heavy. Once again, she was suspected, not because of what she was carrying, but because of who she was. From a distance, Daniel watched. No words, just the quiet observation. But Aura recorded every moment, every glance, every question, every movement was captured in the data. He walked toward her, unhurried. He handed her a business card, quietly but with certainty. If you need support, contact me. Aisha looked at the card in her hand, her grip tightening. She felt the unspoken trust, no explanation needed. She nodded, a small feeling rising in her chest. She didn't know what would happen next, but she realized one thing. Sometimes all you need is someone who sees you. But the cracks in dignity were far from over. Carlos Rivera, 45 years old, a former serviceman, sat in his wheelchair, hands gripping the armrests, eyes fixed ahead. The military medal, a symbol of the years of sacrifice, still pinned to his jacket. But no one noticed. He raised his hand, softly requesting help to board the plane. His voice was low, carrying the patience worn thin by time, yet there was still a trace of hope. The flight attendant brushed past, shrugged, and didn't stop. "Wait a minute, we're busy." Carlos lowered his head, already accustomed to this neglect. The crowd hurried by, no one noticing the man sitting there, silent. But then, a gaze. Daniel stood from a distance, seeing him. Aura recorded every moment, the flight attendant walking by without a glance, ignoring Carlos's request, ignoring the man who had given so much of his life for his country. Daniel didn't hesitate. He walked over, his voice rang out, unwavering. "You deserve respect." His words were strong enough to halt the rush around them. He called the flight attendant, demanding they assist Carlos immediately. But he didn't stop there. Before leaving, Daniel handed Carlos a business card, his eyes filled with trust. "Contact me if you need help." In their exchange, a silent connection was formed. And when Daniel turned away, Carlos, without saying a word, simply smiled faintly, his gaze no longer filled with doubt. Never before had he felt so respected. But sometimes the real loss isn't in the suitcase. A middle-aged black man, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit, approached the baggage claim help desk, his face tight with worry. He had just discovered that his Rolex watch, worth over $30,000 and the only gift left to him from his late father, had gone missing from his checked luggage. But instead of receiving help, he was met with suspicion. An airport security officer stared at him and asked, "Are you sure you didn't forget it at home?" Her voice wasn't curious. It was accusatory, one of those tones that said, "We've seen this before." But they'd never seen him. "Have you ever reported a lost item before?" Another officer chimed in. Polite on the surface, but the implication was clear. "Are you making this up to claim compensation?" It didn't stop there. They demanded that he open his carry-on. They sifted through every item, even scrolled through the apps on his phone, as if he weren't the victim of a theft, but a suspect trying to cheat the system. They kept him there for nearly 40 minutes, right before his flight. No apology, no effort to help him find the missing item. Only a trail of humiliation following every step he took as he hurried to the gate, under the gazes of strangers, and the doubt from those who were supposed to protect him. But indifference doesn't stop at just a watch. The flight had not yet taken off. In the middle of the cabin, an elderly woman suddenly felt dizzy. She staggered, gripping the seat in front of her, then vomited onto the floor. Her hands trembled. Her eyes frantically searched for help. Only one flight attendant approached. She put on gloves, wiped the stain briefly, and then silently walked away. No one offered her a napkin. No one asked if she needed oxygen, water, or medical assistance. Everyone just backed away. Some passengers grimaced, others turned away, their eyes glued to their phones. The atmosphere in the cabin felt chillingly distinct, not because of the air conditioning, but because of something far colder. The coldness of indifference, when no one is forced to care. Later in the flight, a passenger in economy class, young, pale, clearly exhausted, pulled up his tray and pointed at the wilted greens. "Excuse me, I think this meal has gone bad. It smells strange, and there's mold on the vegetables." The flight attendant barely glanced at it and responded like she was reading from a script. "That's the standard for economy class, sir." He tried to explain that he had been food poisoned before and was very sensitive. She just shrugged. I checked the sample tray. There's nothing wrong. Maybe you're just too picky. Her voice wasn't harsh, but it still struck him straight to the core. His face flushed. He set the tray aside. He didn't touch another bite. A passenger a few rows back whispered, "Same thing happened to me once." They never apologize. No one stood up to object. But every single glance, every single one, looked at the flight attendant with a shared expression. That's how they treat me. I just didn't say anything that day. But that indifference doesn't stop with adults. Jamal stood in the quiet corner of the security checkpoint, his worn-out backpack clutched tightly in his hands as if it contained his entire world. A beat-up, unbranded laptop. No logos, no labels. Worn keys. A battery on the brink of dying. But to Jamal, it was the only window into the tech world he dreamed of. To the TSA agents, it was a threat. They pulled him aside, asking procedural questions, but full of doubt. Jamal lowered his head, his voice trembling. "I just want to learn about technology over there." No one heard him. No one stopped. He was just a shadow in their eyes. But one person saw him. Daniel stepped forward, his gaze calm, resolute. "If you really want to learn AI, contact me after the flight." He handed Jamal a sleek black business card with the Aura logo embossed on it. No promises, just a steady, silent look of trust. Weeks later, a package arrived for Jamal. A brand new Dell XPS with an NVIDIA RTX processor. Keep going. That was the message. Because Daniel knew, sometimes change only takes one timely look, one person seeing you when no one else does. But sometimes even a simple question can save an entire dream. Elijah Nuru, 19 years old, a first-year computer science student working part-time to save for tuition. A name that no one remembers, a dream that no one asks about. Daniel approached. His gaze wasn't that of an outsider, but of someone who had once stood in the same place. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, gently. Elijah flinched, looking up, a slender face, deep eyes that flickered with a fire that never burned out. "I'm just working here for the summer, saving for school." His voice barely a whisper. "What are you studying?" Daniel asked. "Programming. I want to work in AI, maybe Silicon Valley." He smiled wryly. "But no one in my family went to college. My mom says I should be an electrician, a safe, stable job." A quiet laugh, tinged with sadness. "I don't know if I'm good enough to dream that big." Daniel didn't answer right away. In the warm glow of the airport corridor, he didn't just see a guy wiping up spilled milk. He saw himself, at 19, wearing borrowed clothes, holding a dream too big for the world to hold. Heart scarred from being told, "You don't fit." Daniel pulled out his Aura business card from his pocket, gently placing it in Elijah's hand. "If you want to learn AI," he said, "email me after summer. Give yourself a chance. I believe you can do something great." Elijah looked down at the card, his fingers trembling. "Really, sir?" Daniel smiled. "When I was your age, I had a dream this big. And an empty wallet. Trust me, the dreams worth chasing don't need anyone's permission." Elijah nodded his thanks. Daniel turned and walked away. But in his heart, he knew a seed had been planted in soil that the world had forgotten to water. And this time, he wouldn't let it die. But sometimes, the smallest injustice leads to a colossal truth. Daniel saw it more clearly now. Discrimination wasn't just about skin color. It ran deeper, more insidious, lurking in the way the system quietly classified people, who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. It hid within neutral procedures, yet nourished invisible biases, in the awkward glances when the vulnerable dared to speak up. And worst of all, in the silence society reserves for those without privilege. No one speaks out. And so, the system continues to operate, suffocating not only rights but also dignity. But then, cracks began to show, not from a major assault, but because the truth finally found a way to speak. Altaris Airlines was embroiled in an internal scandal. Allegations of money laundering through shell investment funds, backdoor deals with suppliers to receive kickbacks. And most seriously, technical data was falsified concerning aircraft safety procedures. Leaked reports revealed Altaris had deployed Boeing 737 MAX planes before completing FAA safety checks. The risk was no longer a hypothesis. They were flying every day. The consequences came swiftly. The FAA and SEC launched investigations. Penalties followed. The fleet was grounded. Massive financial recovery awaited. A federal criminal investigation loomed. Altaris stock plummeted. Investors were panicked. Pressure mounted. The leadership was forced to consider the unthinkable, selling the airline at a loss just to avoid complete collapse. But the truth, ultimately, cannot be buried forever. That night, in a modest hotel room in Boston, Daniel sat silently beside Grace. A soft yellow light glowed on his glasses. The TV was still on, broadcasting the aftermath of Altaris. Grace didn't say anything. She simply poured a cup of hot tea, her way of being present when words weren't enough. Daniel looked up, his eyes met hers. His voice was low, but resolute. "I'm going to buy Altaris." Grace froze. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the teacup down. "It's not because of what they did to you today," Daniel continued, "but because if I do nothing, there will be more. People who have no voice, no cameras, no one to make a call to force the system to listen." That decision didn't come from anger. It came from vision. A vision of an airline built on transparency, where human dignity isn't measured by logos, skin color, or the class printed on a boarding pass, where technology doesn't hide injustice, but illuminates it. Daniel understood one uncomfortable truth. Silence is complicity. And if he didn't act, he was no different from those who turned away. But he didn't announce his plan. Not yet. He waited for the full truth about Altaris to come to light. Waited for this very system to collapse under the weight of what it had tried to bury. Because Daniel knew true justice doesn't need to scream. It only needs the right moment. Aura is not just software. It is a witness. Quietly, it records everything from behind closed doors. Integrated into Altaris Airlines as part of a security agreement, no one realized it had been there for a long time, back when Daniel was just a technology partner. He didn't run the company, didn't make the decisions. He only oversaw silently, but always present. Aura had access to Altaris's system. Emails, security footage, maintenance records. Every month, Aura recorded it all. The violations, the manipulations, the ethical breaches, but no one listened. The alerts were ignored or edited before they reached leadership. The warnings continued to fall into silence, like screams swallowed in the darkness of the night. Aura was created to ensure transparency, but it was smothered by the very silence it was born to fight. Daniel realized, if this continued, technology would not change anything. And the real people, the ones who would be hurt, left behind, would continue to suffer. He silently moved Aura into deep storage. Every data point, surveillance videos, emails, maintenance logs was encrypted, secured, and legally stored, not for a counterattack, but for protection. Not for revenge, but for the restructuring, evidence that no one could deny. "I didn't create Aura to monitor them," Daniel would say in a later hearing. "I created Aura to protect the ones the system forgot." One night, Malik Johnson, an IT engineer at Altaris, stumbled upon Aura while checking the server system. At first, he thought it was a vulnerability, an intrusion. But after reviewing the contract and access permissions, he realized the truth. Everything Aura did was legal. Every file stored was undeniable truth, things the leadership at Altaris had spent years trying to conceal. And instead of reporting it to his superiors, Malik decided to stand with Aura. He kept the connection live, not letting anyone stop it. And then, Aura acted. It silently transmitted all verified data to the SEC, security footage, audio recordings, transfer trails, maintenance logs, all proving a system rotten from the inside. The warnings that had been ignored became the spark for an investigation the aviation industry had never seen. The media storm erupted, headlines across the country, panic on Wall Street, subpoenas from Congress. And while everything around him burned, Daniel Okoye said nothing. He didn't step forward. Not yet. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes in silence and is supported by evidence. For Daniel knew, only when the mask falls and every truth is exposed will his decision carry the weight it deserves. Not revenge, but the beginning of a new era. And when the last mask falls, no one can deny the truth anymore. The charges: falsifying financial reports, corporate ethics violations, obstructing a federal investigation, and concealing aviation safety risks. Within 72 hours, the entire board of directors was summoned. Stock prices plummeted. Major partners pulled out. Institutional investors rushed to dump their shares. Altaris entered a state of technical bankruptcy, the classic collapse of a corporate empire built on greed, performative policies, and the silence of those who should have spoken out. And then, while the world was still reeling, Daniel stepped forward, not in anger, not to celebrate. He simply said, "I will buy Altaris," not to save a broken airline, but to rebuild a system where justice is no longer programmed through the filter of personal bias. At the official press conference, he announced the airline's new name, Ubuntu Air, a name tied to an ancient African philosophy. I am because we are. Because dignity should never be defined by a cold system. The acquisition was swift. When trust collapses, value is just a number waiting to disappear. The old owners had no choice but to sell, to salvage whatever was left. But just as Daniel reached for the pen to sign the final contract, he paused. In the list of strategic shareholders, a name made him stop. Brad Whitmore, chairman of the board, the largest shareholder, heralded as a financial genius in the airline industry, and it was that man who had stolen Daniel's first AI invention. Almost 20 years ago. Back then, Daniel was a passionate, idealistic founder, full of energy and dreams. Bradley had tricked him into signing away the intellectual property rights. He sold the technology for millions of dollars, leaving Daniel with empty hands, shattered trust, and a contract soaked in betrayal. That day, Bradley had looked him in the eye and sneered, "There's no room for dreamers in this world, kid." But now, the same man was being forced to sell everything he owned just to escape prosecution. Daniel said nothing. He signed, silently, calmly, with the hands that once built code from fragments and dreams from ashes, because the circle had closed, not with revenge, but with the silent triumph of belief, resilience, and a dream that never dies. That's not revenge, that's rebirth. Capitol Hill, 6 months after the Atlanta incident. The hearing room was packed. Flashbulbs from cameras cut through the tense air. Grace and Daniel Okoye entered, ready to face what was coming. Grace, who had dedicated her life to advocating for the forgotten youth, held a folder of testimonies. Each page was a story of passengers crushed by this system. Beside her stood Daniel, the founder of Aura, the anti-discrimination AI system. His gaze was sharp, unwavering. A CEO from a rival airline leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Your Aura is sabotaging the airline industry with its excessive surveillance." Daniel didn't flinch. He just tapped on his tablet. The screen projected Aura data, thousands of incidents of discrimination, from Grace being denied entry into the first-class lounge to employees being pressured to falsify safety reports. "Aura isn't sabotaging," Daniel replied, his voice unchanged. "It's exposing. Protocol Michelle has uncovered what you've been hiding for years." Grace stood up, her voice resonating in the room. "This is not just my story. This is the story of every passenger judged by the color of their skin, their accent, or the ticket they hold." Her gaze locked on the executives. There wasn't a hint of wavering. Behind them, a young baggage handler, who had recorded the humiliation Grace endured, stood silently, clutching a fellow employee's grievance letter. A journalist, who had previously called Aura cold surveillance technology, quietly took notes. His gaze shifted from doubt to understanding. The screen displayed Aura's architecture, every decision recorded, every alert traceable, every mistake explainable. Daniel continued, calm yet firm. "Aura doesn't replace humans. It does what we've forgotten, speaks the truth." He declared, eyes never leaving the senators. "Ubuntu Air has signed an agreement with the country's top AI ethics board. Every system, every audit, every record, completely transparent. No gray areas, no exceptions." An FAA official stood up, his voice strong. "Aura's evidence is irrefutable. It will operate under federal oversight to ensure justice within the airline industry." The senators nodded, a few clapped. A journalist immediately posted on X, "Aura is not just AI. It is the conscience of a new era." As Grace and Daniel left the room, whispers began to spread. Ubuntu Rising trended globally. From Nairobi to New York, on the TV screen a headline appeared, "Ubuntu Air, an airline redefining dignity." The battle wasn't over. But the flight for justice had taken off, from the silence of the system to the truth beginning to emerge. The entire operation of Altaris Airlines began to collapse, quickly and loudly. Flights were delayed for no reason. Some were canceled just before takeoff. Videos flooded social media. Planes idling on the runway for hours. Gate agents nowhere to be found. Customer service lines hanging up after saying, "We apologize for the inconvenience." But the breaking point didn't come from the passengers. It came from those who had been silenced. Former employees, engineers, flight attendants, technicians began stepping forward. They talked about being pressured to alter maintenance logs to pass inspections, signing off on safety tests that were never performed. And when they protested, they were reassigned. Bonuses cut, silently placed on the no promotion list. A senior engineer revealed emails with proof. Flight data had been altered by the executive team. Flight attendants spread video from a closed-door meeting, a supervisor sternly telling them, "If you want to keep your job, don't say anything." Suddenly, the doors opened. Security camera footage, anonymous messages, audio recordings from back rooms and hangars, many of them traced back to whistleblowers who had quietly worked with Aura. Now they stood beside Daniel. Public outrage erupted. Hashtags like #TruthAboveAirspace and Alterous Cover-Up trended on X. CNN, Bloomberg, The New York Times, all reporting the same story. Top 5 U.S. airlines under federal investigation for safety interference and silencing whistleblowers. The FAA and SEC launched large-scale investigations, but just as the truth was exposed, Daniel found himself in one of the darkest hours of his life. A small glitch in Aura had inadvertently flagged an innocent employee. Although the error was corrected within hours, the media pounced. The biggest tabloid newspaper ran the headline, "Daniel Okoye's AI, Justice or Surveillance." Anti-AI groups flooded newsrooms and online forums. A few partner companies suspended contracts. Daniel's company's stock dropped 12% in a single day. He sat alone in his office. No lights, no screens, silence. From collapse to recovery, justice is not just victory, but a promise to hold steady. He didn't say a word for hours, until his phone buzzed. A message lit up on the screen, "Thank you for the laptop. I wouldn't be here without you." Jamal, just one short sentence. But it was enough. Enough to pull him from the edge of doubt. Enough to remind him. He didn't build Aura to win. He built it so those who are silenced could be heard. A few minutes later, Grace walked in. She didn't say much, just gently sat beside him, took his hand, and softly said, "You started all of this for the voiceless, so don't let the noise drown out that purpose." Daniel turned to look at her, and in his eyes, something shifted. Not anger, but the return of something deeper. The reason he started this in the first place. Not for accolades, but to keep a promise to the boy who once had his future stolen, and to the version of himself from 20 years ago. Still standing in the shadows, still believing there had to be a better way. At this point, Daniel's acquisition of Altaris had made headlines. But legally and operationally, the transfer of power was not yet complete. He still didn't have the right to intervene. However, what had happened wasn't a delay. It was a spark, a reminder that the system wouldn't fix itself. So, when the transfer was completed just days later, Daniel didn't step into the executive room like a businessman. He stepped in like a man ready to rebuild the system. From the inside. When justice isn't just an action, but the process of changing a system from the roots up. It wasn't Aura that caused the chaos. The failure had been quietly rotting for years. Ignored. Justified. Hidden behind phrases like industry standard or it's just how things operate. Aura didn't break the system. It just turned the lights on. And once that light was on, there was nowhere left to hide. The system had to face itself. Daniel stood before the entire Altaris team and made his first public statement. No one will be fired for fear or bias. No one will be protected by hiding behind the words just following orders. And no one will be judged by perception, but by actions. The entire workforce would be reevaluated by Aura, publicly, transparently, based on 3 core principles: ethical integrity, willingness to collaborate, and accountability in crisis. No title would be exempt. No seniority would be immune. Those who spoke up, despite risking their own positions, would be invited to join the leadership. And those who stayed silent before the truth or chose silence to protect themselves would face a system that remembered everything they thought had been forgotten. But just when it seemed like justice had been coded into the system, a familiar obstacle emerged. Richard Lansing, The former CEO, the man who once held near absolute control over every technical decision at Alteris. 2 decades of experience, deep ties with suppliers, unions, and regulatory bodies. To the outside world, he presented himself as a traditionalist. But behind closed doors, Richard was fighting for the one thing he had left, a seat of power built on backroom deals and the decay of the system. But when the protector of the past faces the future, change is no longer a choice. It's an uncompromising battle. He had once forced engineers to sign off on safety checks that had never been done, ignored the red flags about faulty equipment, approved subpar suppliers as long as the bribes were carefully hidden. He was the architect of shortcuts. And now, he was the final barrier between Daniel and a revolution the entire industry was watching. But the real danger of Richard wasn't just his position. It was his familiarity. Because he represented not just one man, but hundreds, thousands, who had built their careers on stagnation, manipulation, and influence over merit. People who didn't need to shout loud, they only needed to speak with confidence. "I know how the system works," they'd say. And for a long time, that was enough. But this time the system wasn't operating in the shadows anymore. And Daniel knew, to truly change the machine, he wouldn't just need to dismantle the structure. He'd have to face the man who built it. A man ready to suffocate the future to protect his past. In the first internal meetings at Ubuntu Air, Richard Lansing didn't retreat quietly. He moved in silence, whispering doubts into ears, rallying middle managers who still clung to the old model, stirring fears about change, then slowing the rollout of Aura with subtle administrative traps. He didn't stop things outright. He clogged them up. Delays in approvals, excessive paperwork, convenient misinformation. But that wasn't all. Richard continued to feed misleading stories into the company's internal press, publishing vague editorials asking whether AI should control humans. He knew exactly where to strike, exploiting fears about privacy, personal freedom, and excessive technological control. Daniel wasn't just fighting the old system. He was facing a national battle over justice and technology. His goal? To turn Daniel from a pioneer into a symbol of cold, algorithmic control, a man trying to replace the human heart with data. But what Richard didn't anticipate was the new generation watching. Young engineers, flight attendants, ground staff, those who had once been silenced, now no longer afraid. With renewed faith in Aura and Daniel, they began to speak up. They sent reports of wrongdoing, marked suspicious messages, and quietly, Aura began to gather every manipulated number, each altered form, every hidden directive. Line by line, each click, the truth began to resurface. The shadows Richard had built cracked under the weight of transparency. This was no longer an internal conflict within the company. It was a war between two worlds, the selfish comfort of the old system and the relentless hope for a fairer future. And it would become Daniel's final test, if he could leave behind a legacy worth inheriting. But the battle wasn't over. A group of former Alteris shareholders who had secretly profited from its decline had teamed up with a few conservative politicians connected to Richard. Together, they filed a lawsuit against Daniel in federal court. The charge? Exploiting AI to manipulate personnel and consolidate power. It was a perfect storm. Just as America was grappling with questions of AI, ethics, and privacy, Daniel found himself at the center of a national debate. But instead of shying away from the fire, he walked straight into it. Daniel called for a public hearing before the United States Senate. So does the truth have enough power to bring down the system? And when the darkness begins to fall, who will stand firm? No press release, no grand declarations. The largest internal reform in the history of the airline industry began quietly, behind closed doors. No cameras, no speeches, just one man asking the right questions and listening to the data. Daniel, as calm as ever, sat across from each department head in a modest meeting room at the new Ubuntu Air headquarters. No commands, just silence, understanding, and clarity. He didn't start with the flight crew. He didn't start with company strategy. He started with the kitchen. The industrial kitchen, where the once hurried meals for economy class were rushed out, cold vegetables, spoiled produce, and a team too exhausted to meet hygiene standards. Daniel ordered a full supply chain audit, from the carrot farms to the warehouse that packed them. Then he moved on to ground maintenance. He spoke directly with the night shift technicians, took back the handwritten logs, and reviewed the time-stamped warnings from frequent minor mechanical issues often recorded as delayed, no time to address. He didn't assign blame. He didn't reprimand. He didn't search for culprits. He sought the system that allowed these failures to persist. And then the data came. When Aura's records were cross-checked with employee testimonies, internal security footage, and previously hidden emails, the truth appeared as ink on a blank page. Richard Lansing and his team, once untouchable, now under ethical audit. And then the data came. Will the hidden secrets finally be exposed? No longer a matter of speculation. Now everything was clear evidence, undeniable. Now it was timestamps. Now it was video. Now it was names, verified by an independent oversight board, legal experts, aviation safety inspectors, union representatives. Daniel didn't judge. He simply presented. And let transparency speak for itself. In the internal Altaris Airlines meeting, the room was dead silent. A large screen displayed Richard Lansing ordering the signing of a safety inspection before the inspection had even taken place. An email requesting data manipulation. A recording threatening a whistleblower. A timesheet edited to conceal overtime. Richard stood up, his watch gleaming, voice cold as steel. You think a few lines of code can overthrow me, Daniel? This industry runs on relationships. Daniel, holding his tablet, eyes unwavering, replied, Your relationships are built on lies. He tapped quickly, the screen displaying Richard's email, his signature clear. You covered up discrimination, just like the system once abandoned my mother. Richard clenched his fist, his voice faltering. You don't understand the pressure. Daniel looked at him, a brief silence before he interrupted. I understand enough. And I won't let anyone be left behind again. Richard remained silent. His shadow vanished under the light of the truth. No shouting, no denial. Only Richard, sweat soaking his shirt, gripping the chair, his legacy slipping through his hands. His resignation was independently verified, made public, undeniable. Malik, the young engineer who had been fired for refusing to falsify the inspection logs, stood up, his voice shaking. Thank you for believing that the truth could protect people. Daniel looked up, responding softly, Not data, the truth. Ubuntu Air's culture was born not from rules, but from belief, a belief in each other, in protecting human dignity. Ubuntu Rising erupted on X as employees shared this moment from their phones. Evidence is clear, but is this truth strong enough to change everything? The results weren't just reflected in spreadsheets or operational charts. 3 months after the restructuring, the name Ubuntu Air began to spread across social platforms. Not as a company, but as a movement. On Skytrax, TripAdvisor, and Yelp, customer service ratings soared. People weren't just praising better food or flights on time, they were saying something stronger. For the first time, I felt seen. A Vietnamese-American woman posted, The staff didn't ask me if I was sure I had a first-class ticket. She just smiled and said, Welcome back, Miss Nguyen. A disabled man wrote, They asked me what assistance I needed, not if I needed to ask for permission. Like that was just normal, and it should be. The posts flooded in, not from an advertising campaign, but from real people, feeling real change. Aura streamlined operations. Customer complaints dropped by 60% in just 90 days. Response times doubled. Safety, transparency, and human dignity, finally, aligned. Federal agencies like the FAA and Department of Transportation recognized Ubuntu Air as a model airline post-crisis. A system where ethics weren't just written in brochures, but woven into every click, every decision. Other airlines began studying the data-driven ethical model. What was once an exception had now become the standard. Then the question arose, who would lead Ubuntu Air into the next era? All eyes turned to Daniel, but he shook his head. Not me, he said. Not because he couldn't, but because he knew. A journey should be led by someone who stood on the other side of the door. Someone who knows what it feels like to stand in line and never hear their name called. That night, in the small room where they once shared every last dollar to pay rent, Daniel took Grace's hand. The light in his eyes was warm, like a lamp that had never stopped burning through the darkness. The next CEO doesn't have to be the smartest about finances, and when Ubuntu Air's journey becomes a movement, the question will no longer be, who will lead, but who will truly keep its soul alive? They have to be someone who understands the feeling of being given a chance at just the right moment. And that person is you. She's a risk analyst at a humanitarian organization, a woman who once oversaw intake systems for refugees and migrants, people without a voice, no papers, no one to speak for them. She's seen thousands of people turned away simply because their papers weren't impressive enough, because their accent wasn't American enough, because their name didn't sound right. Grace rewrote entire response procedures, infusing dignity into every line of cold, bureaucratic texts, the kind of language that felt like stone, hard, impersonal, and unchangeable. When she joined Aura, Grace was the one who proposed the regulation that changed everything. Every AI decision must be supervised by a human heart. Daniel looked into her eyes. I might have built Ubuntu Air with code, but you'll be the one to keep its soul alive. And then, the girl, who had once been asked to leave the first-class lounge that day, now walks into the executive boardroom. Not because of privilege, not as an exception, but because it was the right choice, a choice nurtured from real-life experiences, by someone who truly understands the feeling of being left out, never forgetting how to give opportunities to those still waiting. And when the forgotten ones rise to leadership, will Ubuntu Air truly be a story of fairness or just a superficial change? At that moment, Daniel stepped onto the stage with an announcement that silenced the entire room. He wasn't just introducing a new CEO, he was introducing a face that the system had once overlooked. Elijah Nuru, the young man who once pushed a food cart through terminals, with calloused hands and a dream buried beneath layers of bias. Years ago, Elijah silently cleaned up spilled milk on the cabin floor after being scolded in front of a crowd. No protest, no complaints. Just a whisper to Daniel, I want to learn about AI, but maybe I'm not good enough to do it. Daniel had placed a business card in his hand and said, I was once like you. That's why I believe in you. Dreams never make mistakes. Sometimes it's just about learning how to believe you're worthy of them. And Elijah emailed. He started over, back to the basics. Working nights to pay for tuition, each line of code, a step forward through the doubt. Years later, Elijah graduated from MIT. His thesis focused on AI ethics in the aviation industry. Today, he stands before the microphone, with those same eyes, with that calm voice, but no longer with his head bowed. He looks straight ahead, like a torch now lit in the hearts of those once told they weren't worthy of dreaming. Daniel announces, Elijah Nuru is now the Chief AI Officer at Ubuntu Air, the leader of the next generation of ethical technology in the aviation industry. He wasn't chosen because of his GPA. He was chosen because he knows what it feels like to be left out of the game. And because he swore, no one else would ever have to feel that way again. That's why Daniel's decision, Grace as CEO, Elijah as the next generation leader, wasn't just a human resources strategy. It was a statement, loud and clear, without a microphone. Ubuntu Air will not be led by those born in the spotlight, but by those who have walked through the darkness and understand the power of a hand extended at the right moment. Later that same day, Daniel made another announcement. Malik Johnson would join the core technical team. Malik, the young IT engineer who had uncovered Aura's ethical alerts, silenced by the old leadership, was the first to speak up. Before anyone else had the courage to look, he didn't just bring sharp technical intelligence. He brought something stronger. The spirit of young engineers who choose truth over the safety of silence. The ones who stand up in the system, not from the outside of it. Malik will oversee Aura's data security at Ubuntu Air, not to monitor people, but to ensure that technology still serves justice, not power. And so this trio, Grace, Elijah, Malik, they didn't come from flashy resumes or Ivy League headlines. They came from places where they were once overlooked, doubted, and diminished. And when the overlooked rise to lead, will Ubuntu Air truly change? And now, they are the answer. The first recipient of the Ubuntu Scholarship Fund was Jamal, the fragile, quiet boy who had been stopped at airport security, not for what he said, but because he was carrying a homemade old laptop, a laptop that had once been seen as a threat. But Jamal held it, his eyes unwavering, refusing to give up. He became the seed of a new generation. With the right guidance, Jamal was accepted into a top-tier AI program. After years of relentless effort, he officially joined the rising leadership team at Ubuntu Air. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a living symbol of a generation that never crumbled under pressure, of those who were doubted but never stopped believing in their true value. When the overlooked rise up, can the lost values be reclaimed? The day Alturas was officially sold, the media exploded. Daniel Okoye, a Kenyan-American CEO, acquires one of the largest airlines in the U.S. On the quiet third floor, in a forgotten corner office, Daniel sat alone. In front of him, a dusty wooden box. Inside it, a few faded letters, a rusty keychain, and at the bottom, an old photo. Two young men, one black, one white, standing outside a university gate, shoulder to shoulder, laughing as if nothing could ever tear them apart. The man on the left is Daniel, and the other, Ethan Ubuntu Whitmore, his one true friend from college. The man who sacrificed everything to protect him. During a routine traffic stop that should have been nothing more than a regular check. That day, they were just driving home after a group presentation. But Daniel was pulled from the car, forced to the ground because he fit the description. Ethan stepped forward, raised his hand, and made it clear, he didn't do anything. I'm the one driving. Then, a gunshot. Just one, but loud enough to tear the world apart. Ethan fell, bleeding in Daniel's arms. The report called it a procedural error. But to Daniel, it was a wound caused by a society too afraid to face the truth. Years later, when a reporter asked, "Why name the airline Ubuntu Air?" Daniel only smiled, his eyes distant, his voice steady, because it's not just a philosophy, it's the middle name of the boy who taught me. That dignity never needs a reason to be protected. With the name Ubuntu, has true change come, or is it just a tribute to the forgotten? No bright stage lights, no flashy host, just two elderly figures sitting quietly by the window, Ethan Ubuntu Whitmore's parents. Years ago, they lost their son to a system that refused to listen. And today, a staff member gently hands them a small envelope, no extravagant gift inside, just a card, jade green. And on it, a single line, lifetime first-class ticket for the parents of the young man who stood up for his conscience on the streets of America. They didn't say a word, just held each other's hands. Tears fell softly. In a room full of silence, gratitude rang out like a storm, not through a microphone, not through bright lights, but through the simple act of placing the forgotten ones in the place they truly belonged. With Ubuntu Air's first flight, will those who were overlooked by the system finally reclaim their worth? Then Daniel stepped into the meeting room with his wife Grace and the core team of Ubuntu Air. A room flooded with natural light. Employees were gathered around the table. But today, there was no tension, no corporate coldness. Instead, there was openness, a sense of shared trust, a common goal. People started to share their stories, what they'd been through, the injustices they'd faced before joining Ubuntu Air. Aisha spoke up first, about the doubt she'd felt at the security checkpoint, how she'd been looked down on, and how Ubuntu Air's new system gave her recognition. Carlos followed, recounting the times he'd been overlooked despite his qualifications, his experience, until he found Ubuntu Air, where he could truly contribute. Grace looked around the room, her eyes filled with emotion. She stood, her hand tight in Daniel's, and said, "We've fought so long to get here. Ubuntu Air isn't just an airline. It's a symbol of change. We will build a team that is dedicated, that cares. We will never let a passenger endure what we've been through again." Grace paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. Then she continued, "I was discriminated against right here at this airport, by the very system we are breaking down today." The room fell silent, a heavy, shared silence. Daniel stood, his gaze unwavering. That's exactly why Ubuntu Air exists, to write new pages in history, history where everyone is respected, everyone is recognized. The silence continued, but it wasn't empty. It was the silence of unity, of resolve. Everyone in the room joined hands, forming a circle, their eyes locked on Daniel and Grace. One goal, shared by all, to build a future of fairness, where everyone has an opportunity, where everyone is recognized. The sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, where those once overlooked by the system now sat together. Linda Gomez, once a cleaner on the airplane floors, gripping the armrest of seat 1A, her eyes sparkling as the plane took off. For the first time, she whispered, "I feel seen." Beside her, Jamal, the boy who once typed code on an old laptop, holding tightly to the bag containing his AI internship contract with Ubuntu Air. Daniel gave me a chance, he said, his smile wide, brighter than before. In the control room, Elijah Nehru, the new director of AI, monitored the Aura system, ensuring every decision was transparent. This isn't just technology, he said over the intercom. It's trust. Malik Johnson, the young engineer who exposed Richard Lansing's wrongdoings, stood at the boarding gate checking the passenger list. He smiled when he saw a familiar face, David Carter, the man once suspected of stealing a $30,000 Rolex at the Atlanta airport. Now, David held his Ubuntu Air ticket. The watch returned, thanks to Aura's data. They didn't just find my watch, David said, his voice choked. They gave me back my dignity. Isha Khalid, the teacher, adjusting her headscarf, gently holding the textbooks, ready to teach her remote class. She felt the freedom, finally, no longer facing doubt. Carlos Rivera, the former soldier, gripping the armrest of his wheelchair, his eyes resolute, no longer feeling overlooked when asking for assistance. We believe in your abilities, Daniel remembered. The invitation he'd sent to Carlos to join Ubuntu Air's security team. Ubuntu Air needs people like you. Carlos looked out the window, feeling as though he'd just stepped into a new world. A world where his efforts and dignity would never be overlooked again. As the plane soared through the sky, a screen in the cabin flashed a post on X, Ubuntu Air's first flight, where dignity takes off. Ubuntu rising. Linda, Jamal, Elijah, Malik, David, Isha, and Carlos. They were not just passengers or employees. They were living proof that systems can be rebuilt when people believe in each other. The first flight and Aura. Will we truly change a system that has been forgotten? Aura was no longer just an AI system. It had quietly become a revolution in upholding ethics across industries and governments, not just in aviation, but in education, healthcare, public services. Wherever complaints were ignored, wherever the marginalized were silenced, Aura arrived, not as a loud rescuer, but as a steady witness, quietly observing. It analyzed, it reformed, not out of outrage, but based on evidence. It didn't replace people. It only ensured the heart of humanity was heard. In systems that had long been blinded by power, the first flight of Ubuntu Air from the US to Kenya wasn't just a flight route. It was a bridge that Daniel Okoye built with his own hands, connecting two continents and redrawing dreams that had long been neglected on the legal maps of the modern world. This was the first ever direct flight from the US to Nairobi. But to Daniel, it wasn't just about logistics. It was a statement to the world. Kenya, like anyone else, should never have to cross the ocean in the dark. They shouldn't have to gamble their lives for hope. You can come to America through your mind, your ability, and your truth, and you will be welcomed as part of this society, completely, wholly. Will Aura and this first flight truly change the way we view human worth? Seat 1A. It wasn't meant for a politician, not for a celebrity. It was meant for someone who had only ever walked past those seats with a broom in hand. Linda Gomez, 52 years old. She had worked as a janitor for Airlines for 17 years. Throughout her career, she had only ever entered the first-class cabin when it was empty to clean the floors. One day, she turned to a colleague and, with a tired smile, said, "I bet those seats are really comfortable. But people like us, we're just not made to sit in them." Today, she sat in that seat. Seat 1A, first class, with a ticket in her own name. Not because of a favor, not out of charity, but because an airline was bold enough to redefine what it means to value a person. In her hand, she held a worn cleaning cloth, kept as a quiet memento of the years when she felt invisible. A flight attendant gently bowed her head and said, "Thank you for those quiet years. Today, no one is allowed to forget you." The entire cabin applauded. Linda said nothing. She simply placed her hand on the armrest and cried, not because of the seat, but because for the first time in her life, she truly saw herself. Ubuntu Air, does first class truly belong to everyone? It carries a dream of a world where you don't have to risk your life just to be recognized, where you don't have to prove your worth to be treated with dignity, where you simply step on board on your own 2 feet and are respected from the moment you check in. That day in seat 2C sat an elderly white man. His hair was as white as snow, his eyes clouded, weary from the weight of war. a veteran, once deployed to Iraq, now living quietly in a small room on the outskirts of the city, no longer able to afford a flight to visit his grandchildren. Some time ago, he wrote a handwritten letter to Ubuntu Air. Not a complaint, just a heartfelt note about the feeling of being forgotten when you move slowly, hear poorly, and don't know how to use an app. Ubuntu Air didn't just respond to his letter, they turned it into the foundation for a new priority policy for veterans. And they invited him to fly first class. No paperwork, no need to prove anything, just a sincere thank you for a man who once gave everything. In seat 4A sat a woman in an old work uniform, her hands gripping a canvas bag. Her name was Maria Velasquez, a single mother. She'd worked as a janitor at the airport for 9 years. She never imagined herself sitting in an air-conditioned cabin surrounded by elite passengers. But Ubuntu Air chose her to be the first recipient of their logistics scholarship. Maria learned about airport operations, digital tools, and communication skills. And within just 1 year, she became the lead coordinator of the ground operations department. Today, Maria no longer works as a janitor on the floor. She signs off flight manifests with pride in her eyes, not resignation in her voice. At the end of the runway, Daniel stood still. In front of him, the first airplane bearing the Ubuntu Air logo. Its emblem glittered in the morning light, just like the meaning behind its name, I am because we are. In that moment, he didn't see an airplane. He saw a living declaration of justice, hope, and new beginnings. For those who had been pushed aside by the system, Ubuntu Air, where dignity takes flight. Perhaps the most beautiful thing Ubuntu Air has left behind is not just an airline, but a reminder that we all deserve to be seen, heard, and respected, even when we carry no title, even when we step forward with only who we are. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about building a world where dignity is the starting point, not the price we pay to be accepted. Where are you watching this story from? New York, Nairobi, Manila, El Paso, Miami? Drop your city name in the comments below, because when stories like these echo across the world, we know we're not alone. Have you ever witnessed injustice right before your eyes, or been misunderstood just because of your appearance, your accent, or where you come from? We want to hear your story. Share it in the comments, because who knows, someone out there might need to hear your story to find hope. If Daniel's journey resonated with you, hit like to stand with those who believe in justice that transcends borders. And let us know, what part of this story moved you the most? Don't keep this story to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder that they matter. And don't forget to subscribe to Cozy Heart Stories, where every story reminds you that you are important, even when the world sometimes forgets that, because sometimes all we need is for someone to believe we're worthy.